Hello, everybody. It's March 10th, 2025, and certainly early afternoon on the West Coast. The news isn't great. The stock market is collapsing, according to the Financial Times. The Wall Street stocks have tumbled, according to The Guardian. Stocks have registered their heaviest fall of the year. And the New York Times concurs with this. When it comes to the environment more broadly, news isn't particularly good either. Trump's new energy secretary says the world needs more fossil fuels rather than less. And climate activists are suggesting that US will be central to climate fight, even without Trump's involvement. But his US aid cuts will have a huge impact on global climate finance. It's all, certainly from an environmental point of view or an economic point of view, on March 10th, 2025, rather depressing. So what should we do? My guest today, Thor Hanson, is a lifelong environmentalist and outdoors man. He has a new book out. It's called Close to Home: The Wonders of Nature Just Outside Your Door. And Thor Hanson, appropriately enough, is talking to us from outside his own door on the San Juan Islands, on the border of Canada and the United States. Thor, I don't suppose you pay a lot of attention, I'm guessing, to certainly Wall Street news, do you?
Well, I think we all need to pay attention to the news these days, in that it's hard to separate what's happening in Washington, D.C. with how it impacts us wherever we live. So I keep an eye on the news, just as you do, scanning those headlines.
And I apologize for anyone listening. There is a little bit of wind on this, and that's not my fault. That's, if not Thor's fault. He's talking to us from the top of a hill, a beautiful looking hill. Thor, so in all seriousness, you're telling us that the wonders of nature are just outside one's door. We did a show a few years ago with a British writer, Lucy Jones, on the relationship between the natural world and the human psyche. She has a wonderful book out called Losing Eden. Is that one of the messages in Close to Home, that it's good for our psyches to get outside?
Absolutely. And I think particularly in the context of world events, where we are facing these sort of global dire situations, whether it's the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis or the politics that contributes to those, I think it's really important that we have connections to nature that are local, hyper local, even right outside our door, that will allow us to reconnect and rebuild and have those small victories that energize us for the broader fight, and that also contribute to the broader fight in many ways. So part of the impulse and the drive to write the book was to help us find ways to connect with nature wherever we are, right outside the back door.
Thor, as I said to you before we went live, your parents chose your name, Thor Hanson, and that was forcing you one way or the other to become an environmentalist. I don't suppose you could have been an accountant and be called Thor Hanson. Tell me the story of your life. In all seriousness, I know your parents weren't certainly as outdoor types as yourself, but how did you learn to love nature? You're the author of many books about nature. You've dedicated your life to it. And of course, your lifestyle on the San Juan Islands reflects all this.
Well, it's a good question. Certainly the name demands a certain amount of adventure in life, I think. My folks were, my dad was a banker, mom was a school teacher. But on my dad's side, there's a long history of love of fishing and getting outdoors to chase after salmon and codfish and so forth. So I think that was probably my entry into the natural world, and I was hooked from a very early age, so to speak, on nature. And I think that the combination of growing up in a relatively beautiful environment, and then later in life experiencing a lot of places where the environment had been been dramatically altered, and there was a lot of urbanization and so forth, and loss of habitat, sparked in me during my college years a desire to really contribute towards the conservation of the natural beauty that remains in the world, and even the restoration of places that have been lost. And so that set me on a career in conservation biology that took me around the world, studying everything from mountain gorillas in Uganda to songbirds and trees in the tropics of the Americas, and really instilled in me that desire to do research that would contribute toward conservation efforts everywhere. And I did that for quite a long time, and also had a desire then to communicate the results of that research to a broader audience. Because I think for any scientist, you could list a number of experiences where you see these wonderful discoveries or innovations in science that never really make it beyond the relatively limited audience of peer review and scientific journals. Those are important and essential parts of science, but there are many times when we need to take our stories to a broader audience. And so the latter part of my career now has been dedicated to doing just that, through writing books and giving lectures and doing media appearances and so forth, to communicate these marvelous stories to a broader audience.
Yeah, and people will be familiar with some of your books. One was called Buzz, The Nature and Necessity of Bees, another on hurricane lizards, book on seeds, book on feathers, and one book on the impenetrable forest of Costa Rica. I'm a big lover of Costa Rica, so I'm eager to read that book, Tor. Tell me a little bit about where you live. You're on the San Juan Islands. In your bio, you're referred to as somebody being from the Pacific Northwest. When we think about the Pacific Northwest, we think about nature. What's it like on the San Juan Islands? You're talking to us now from it, from a hilltop there. We can see the background of a big sky. I'm guessing it's hard not to wonder at nature if you step outside your front door, Tor.
Certainly, I have the advantage of living in a very rural place, and at the same time, it's one that is surrounded by a rapidly growing human population. We're not too far from Vancouver, British Columbia, or Victoria, British Columbia, or Seattle and Tacoma, Washington, and other large and growing cities. So it's a place where we have natural beauty, but we also can see it changing, and we know that it's under threat, and we are losing species from our environment. We have threatened populations of killer whales and diminished populations of the salmon that they feed upon. So I think the environment is on people's mind here, on a pretty regular basis. Even for folks who may not consider themselves environmentalists, they're probably aware of the changes taking place in this environment. So it is a beautiful place, but one that is also changing and under threat. And so, a natural place for people to look for a connection with nature.
Yeah, as I look at you on that hilltop on the islands, I'm sitting at my desk in San Francisco. I'm rather envious. But are you suggesting, in a sense, Tor, that people shouldn't come to the San Juan Islands? Is one of the perhaps implicit messages in the book is if we want to find nature, we don't have to go to Costa Rica or the San Juan Islands or the Arctic. We can actually find it anywhere.
Well, that's one of the take-home messages for me, and something that I discovered in doing the research for the book. And that is, you don't have to live in a rural part of a rural island in a rural corner of the country to find nature right outside your front door. This sort of opportunity exists everywhere. And one of my favorite examples actually comes from greater Los Angeles.
Of all places, yeah.
Of all places, it's one of the most urbanized landscapes on the planet. And it's a great story, and it comes to us from a fellow named Brian Brown and people he was working with there, Emily Hartop and others. But he's the curator of insects at the Los Angeles Natural History Museum. And he was at a fundraiser luncheon, with a bunch of donors and so forth. And he told me he'd been bragging that, oh, he could find a new species anywhere. He told someone, I could find one in your backyard. And one of the trustees of the museum took him on and said, it's a bet. If you find a new species in my backyard, I will, throw this big fundraiser party at my house in celebration. And to add a little pressure, she went ahead and she scheduled the party. So Brian heads out to her house a few weeks beforehand.
And the house is in downtown LA.
It's in Los Angeles. Yeah. And he sets up his insect trap in her backyard. And he said his fears were alleviated with the first sample he took from that trap. And he started separating out the particular family of flies that he's a specialist in. And the very first fly he looked at was one that he didn't recognize. And he looked in all of the books and tried to identify it, and there was no name for it. So it was a brand new species from this woman's backyard. And so he won the bet. But even more importantly, it was the basis for this new research program, realizing that there's a lot of biodiversity in the backyards of Los Angeles. And so they started setting up traps in collaboration with homeowners all across LA. And to date, they've already found more than 50 new species, undescribed, unknown to science, just looking in people's backyards. So I think that sort of opportunity to be amazed and to discover new things occurs in any neighborhood, no matter where you live.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story, Tor. Although, as you were telling it, I couldn't help thinking about the fires in Los Angeles, the fires late last year, early this year, which destroyed so much. Do you think that you can still do that in Los Angeles post fires? I mean, even with all these various environmental catastrophes that seem to be happening on a daily basis?
Well, the fires were an absolute tragedy, and of course they were exacerbated, driven by by mega droughts and by changes to the landscape, by climate-driven changes to that environment. So again, you see this juxtaposition where you have these global, regional and global trends driving change locally, which makes it all the more important to take advantage of these connections that we have to nature to strengthen our ties to the natural world. And you can do it in LA post fires as well as pre-fires. Now in those fire damaged areas, of course, you're going to see all sorts of regeneration of species and what's going to come into those neighborhoods. It's not only a time to rebuild the human world, but also people will be looking at what they're going to plant and what's going to occupy the natural habitats that return to those disaster areas. So again, we live in this world where we have, cognitive dissonance. We have big global trends that we feel helpless against, which makes it all the more important to connect and have those local victories that we can really take heart in.
Tor, it's interesting you use the word regeneration of nature. I used to have a show called Regenerate, which was about the rewilding phenomenon, and we've done a number of shows on that. What's your take on rewilding? Does it fit in with the themes you're arguing close to home?
Yeah, rewilding starts right where you live. It really honestly does. And I think this is another example of where these backyard efforts can add up to something larger. So it's not only a feel-good experience, but it can also contribute to broader trends of regeneration. And as an example, I point to this great project over in Switzerland and a herpetologist there named Benedict Schmidt. And his project was to look at populations of amphibians in one county or one state, if you will, within Switzerland. And it's a very developed place. It's right to the west of the capital. And there are suburbs, there are industrial areas, there are farms. It's not a pristine landscape. But back in the 1990s, in response to these data that were coming in that amphibians were declining, which is not just in Switzerland, that is a global phenomenon. We see great decreases in the population and the diversity of amphibians on this planet. They're very sensitive to environmental change. So these visionary sort of folks back in the 90s, they were working for the environmental ministry there with volunteers and other people. They started this program where they were going to try to counter that trend by digging ponds in people's backyards, on the edges of farm fields, in community forests, on the edges of villages, wherever they could find space. They were going to encourage landowners and help fund this project of making new ponds. And they've built over 850 of them over the past 30 years. And when Schmidt went out there with his teams and did the analysis of all the data that the volunteers had been gathering at these ponds over the decades, they learned that 10 out of 12 of the native amphibians in that state, in that province of Switzerland, had stopped declining and started growing their populations once again. So 10 out of 12 of the native amphibians, we're talking about frogs, we're talking about salamanders, we're talking about toads, are coming back. One has stabilized, and only 1 out of 12 has continued to decline. So it is an example where a backyard effort adds up to something much larger.
Subtitle of the book, Thor, is The Wonders of Nature Just Outside Your Door. Thinking about the word wonders, there's a spiritual quality to this. Do you think of this in spiritual terms? We're not just quantifying nature here. We're not just charting new species or new phenomenon. We're engaging with nature, and the wonder of it is by definition spiritual, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, the biologists aren't always great at expressing spiritual things in spiritual terms.
And you're very good at that. In fact, talking to you now, I think you need your own TV show. I'm sure other people have told you that.
Right. Well, I do think that there is an element to this that is about a deep connection. It's about a deep connection that we have lost in our increasingly, digital, indoor media and technology focused world, right? But it's one that's much deeper in us than, texting and so forth, in that we come from a tradition of knowing our environment, where we relied upon our connection to the natural world simply to get by day to day, foraging for food, hunting, and finding places to live, farming. All of these deep connections to the land over thousands of years have been replaced in a very short time by smartphones and so forth. So I think it is sort of an act of remembrance as well as an act of learning when we try to reconnect with the natural world.
Do you buy then the thesis of all sorts of social psychologists like Jonathan Haidt that all these devices and all this social media are not just making us lonely, but undermining our mental health, that therefore we live in what he calls an age of anxiety?
I'm not informed enough to have an opinion on exactly how they're affecting our brains, but I do know there is plenty of data out there that tell us coming to natural places improves mental health. It improves it in measurable ways. It improves physical health in all sorts of measurable ways. Lowering anxiety, you can measure, lowering blood pressure, you can measure outcomes that are very tangible from spending time in nature. Even for women who are pregnant, the children will have larger birth weights depending on how much time the mom has spent outdoors during the pregnancy. There are all sorts of very tangible ways to measure this. My absolute favorite comes from a paper that was published, way back in the 80s. I believe it was 84, somewhere back in there. It's a 2-page paper, very readable in Science magazine, and it's from a medical study that was done in a small hospital in rural Pennsylvania, where they looked at data from people recovering from the same gallbladder surgery in the same ward of the hospital. And they controlled for all the differences in age and background and other health factors among all these patients over a 20-year period. And they studied one difference between these sorts of patients. There was one room in that ward that looked out at a little grove of Norway maples, a common, suburban tree. And then the next room over looked across the courtyard at a brick wall. So the only difference was whether or not you were looking at a brick wall or a grove of trees. And the patients that were looking at trees went home faster than the others. They called the nurses' station less often. They needed fewer painkillers, and they suffered fewer complications from their surgery. So in this case, you didn't even have to be outside in nature. You just had to be able to see nature to feel better. And that has laid the groundwork for all sorts of research into just how good for us it is to be outdoors. You can even get a prescription for it in most states and provinces.
Well, of course, you can't replicate nature. That sound of the wind behind you, Thor, I guess we could replicate it, but it wouldn't have the same feeling, would it?
Right. There's something to our physical connection to an outdoor space. And it doesn't have to be a remote hilltop like this. It really, it can be those suburban trees, it can be any outdoor space. And it's something that we used to have a lot more of just in the daily rhythm of life. If you were walking, to the grocery store in a city, or you're out in the back courtyard hanging the laundry, all sorts of little sort of interstitial spaces in our lives were filled with outdoor experiences. Many of those things have been replaced by indoor experiences. Now we order things and they're delivered. Now we throw the laundry in the washer right there in the house, and dryer and so forth. So our time outdoors has been restricted. And I think when we can get back outside, even if we're in a very urban environment, those times outdoors in nature will absolutely benefit health, mentally and otherwise.
Yeah, Thor, as we speak, I'm a few blocks up from Golden Gate Park, which is one of the great parks of the United States. Is one of the arguments in Close to Home a defense of parks, of public space where people can wonder at nature without necessarily having to go up to the San Juan Islands?
Exactly, precisely. These green spaces are vital in wherever people live, and we become a more urban society. So those urban green spaces are of huge importance. And there's a social justice element to it as well, in that we tend to have a lot more green spaces in the wealthier parts of cities than in the
Well, that's certainly true in San Francisco.
Yeah, so anything to bring more green into the city in general is going to benefit people from all walks of life.
You are an educator. You've spent your life now, as you say, the second part of your life, educating mainstream public about nature. The book looks to me as if it's designed for educating children. Is that a particular focus of your work and your thinking? Are children, so to speak, more susceptible to your message than grown-ups, or are we all open to this?
Well, I think everyone is open to it. And I try to write the books to a very broad audience. They are certainly accessible to high school students. I know they have been used in high school courses as well. When I'm speaking to younger kids, I have done several children's books that are really focused on 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds and so forth. And so I do spend time trying to communicate in that fashion as well. And again, I mean, it's in some ways it's not hard because we're born to this in a sense. I mean, you go try to find, a pair of pajamas for your toddler that it's not covered with animals. Of course they're covered with animals. The kids connect with animals. It's part of what we're born to do. And so I think looking for ways to encourage that and to make those opportunities happen for kids, again, they have to be familiar with technology. That's the world they're growing up in. But to divorce them from the outdoors is a terrible thing. So you need to find pathways for both.
There seems to be something natural about kids and nature. If you put kids outdoors, they'll naturally play with the soil, for example. I know we did some shows on that in my Regenerate series. Are children in that sense more natural when they find themselves in nature? They're not uncomfortable with getting themselves dirty, whereas for us grown-ups, it's a different thing.
Oh, you've absolutely hit upon it. And in a sense, it's part of our conditioning as we are brought up in society, in that we learn to create barriers between ourselves and incoming information, right? We learn to block out all of the extraneous information that assaults us all day long in the human world, right? If you couldn't do it, you couldn't walk down the street, because you've got signs and you've got music and you've got cars, you've got traffic noise, you've got your cell phone is ringing, someone else's cell phone is ringing, there are newspapers, there's media everywhere. If you couldn't block it out and focus on your own day, you'd never get anywhere. So it's a sensory disorder if you can't block it out. But the trouble is, of course, when we build up those barriers, they block out the sound of the wind, they block out the call of the warbler, they block out the beauty of nature just as well as they do the rest of it. And so kids have yet to build up all of those barriers, right? They're still in that process. So they see more in nature, they hear more in nature. I tell people all the time, if you want to go out on a nature walk, don't take field guides, take a child. Take a child, borrow one if you don't have one, in that they
Feel
will
one.
they will see more, because not only are they down lower to the ground, but they haven't blocked out as much information as we have. And I have time and again been amazed by the things that kids find in nature that the rest of us have been stepping over. They see the spider egg sacs and the frog eggs, and they find the little insects in the soil and things that we just stride right over and pay no attention to. So they're wonderful conduits for us. And that sort of relationship, that participation with children in nature, encourages them at the same time.
Yeah, you put it very well, Tor. I'm not sure if you've read Rousseau, but he, of course, is the founder of a school that suggests that modernity has essentially alienated us from ourselves. That's what you're kind of saying, isn't it?
I think there's an aspect to that that's certain, in that we have, as a species, a long history of deep connection to the natural world. And if you want an example of that, all you have to do is meet or read about people who are still living more of a subsistence lifestyle, and you realize that their connection to the natural world, it goes way beyond even what us trained biologists have learned in a career. There is a deep cultural connection there that has only recently slipped away from most of us.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thesis, and I strongly encourage everyone to look at the new book, Close to Home: The Wonders of Nature Just Outside Your Door. It's filled with examples. Maybe we can end, Tor, with your favorite example from the book. It's filled with examples of what we can see just outside our door. But what's your favorite story on this?
Well, it changes all the time, but one of my favorites is a project where they weren't just asking what's out there, which is the first question, but they were asking, what's it doing? And this comes to us from Barbara Klump, who is an annual animal behavioralist. And she started this project down in Sydney, Australia. And she put out radio advertisements, newspaper advertisements, asking the people living in the suburbs around Sydney the same question. She wanted to know if they had ever seen a parrot opening their garbage can. And over 1,300 people responded and gave her all of this data that, in fact, the parrots were opening the garbage cans. And she was able to then track this behavior as it developed from 3 neighborhoods and spread across 42 neighborhoods as the parrots taught one another how to do it and taught each other different techniques in different neighborhoods. So with the help of all these people living in Sydney, she was able to document the development of what technically is the development of a culture in these parrots as they taught one another different techniques for getting into the trash.
Well, Thor Hanson, I'm going to let you go back to your natural environment on San Juan Island. You don't have to stare at a computer screen anymore. This is, I think, the first time we've done an outdoor interview, certainly with an environmentalist. Very appropriate, the medium and the message. But congratulations on the new book, Close to Home. It's a very important book, but certainly a very important message about the wonders of nature just outside your door. Thor Hanson is telling you that you don't have to go on some big nature trip to appreciate nature. So congratulations, Thor, on the new book, and keep doing what you're doing. I think it's extremely important. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.